When God created the heavens, and the earth, and the waters, and the lands, and all the beasts of the field, and everything which creeps on the ground, and the fowl of the air, and the plants and trees, fruits and vegetables, and make no mistake, humankind in his own image, he did so with love. This is what I have come to understand. Before I knew God's grace, I was an alcoholic. I was self-centered, manipulative, deceitful, and a whole litany of other things. I, like you, lived in my own strength, which, according to myself and my ego, was enough. I considered myself clever, wise even, and there was nothing you could tell me about God that I hadn't already made my mind up about. As far as I was concerned, God was dreamed up by some bloke 5,000 years ago, maybe 6, and it became a running state of hysteria which suddenly carried too much momentum to be stopped, in much the same way that a bad joke gets well out of hand and the people just run with it. Noah and his ark, with 2 of every animal on the face of the earth, including those that aren't about anymore, with the exception of the fish, sharks, octopus, seahorses and all them lot, and a global flood which killed off the inhabitants of Earth that it could begin anew. Abraham, ready to murder his own child, in what I would describe as nothing more than an extreme example of the apparent bloodlust their so-called God demanded of the people at that time. But for some reason, not anymore. We'll get into that later. Moses, and the great fable of an unlikely man who led his captive Hebrews and Shebrews and children away from 400 years of oppression and tyranny at the hands of the Pharaoh of the day, only to go on and exist in the desert for years with those same people and even have it as his final resting place before even reaching the promised land. And you wouldn't have even bothered to share with me the story of the parting of the sea, while they fled the Egyptian military, who were then swallowed up by said sea as if a door was opened for Moses and them, but slammed shut on Pharaoh and his minions. Suffice is it to say, I was having none of it. Science told me everything. Everything I needed to know. The stars, what they're made up of, the composition of water, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, the way seasons work, temperature, physiology, biochemical processes and reactions. It told me about space, time, space-time, gravity, and the theory of evolution. I learned how time is relative, and that because gravity exists, and this is a good one, our universe was always going to happen, perchance, given enough time. And with all that, and plenty more besides, I was sold on the idea that there was no need for a God of any description to exist at all, let alone a God who allows suffering, disease and famine to occur, and the deaths of babies in the womb, the children blinded by parasites and insects, or even the cats and dogs who get thrown in rivers now and then for a laugh. Now don't get me wrong, all these are the worst, but bear with me, we'll address them. But science, it seemed, had cracked it. While I wasn't entirely sold on the mechanisms behind determining the facts about the theory of evolution, I trusted that because scientists were telling me these things, they simply must be true. After all, who am I to argue with people who've spent decades of their lives, countless hours in laboratories, experimenting and pursuing the truth with awe-inspiring tenacity, dedication second to none? They told us these things, and they did the groundwork, the education, examinations and hypotheses that made all the sense in the world to average Joe. How on earth was I going to refute, question or dismiss any of that lot? Well, to paraphrase the late Martin Luther King Jr., It all started with a dream. I was working in a lumber mill, and I've got no idea where it was, who I worked for, or anything like that. It was just a lumber mill, and I was operating a huge milling saw with one other fella, who I also didn't recognise. The mill was loud, dusty and cold, so we all wore the appropriate gear like thick gloves and warm beanies and whatnot. It was the end of our shift, so the alarm bell sounded, and we all dropped tools and dusted off the machinery as if it was second nature. So I'm guessing I've been there for a bit, but it's a dream, so who knows. Me and this co-worker cleaned up and finished for the shift, and we were chatting on the way out. But as is the nature with dreams, I can't remember anything audibly about the conversation, just that I got the sense that we got along well enough to make small talk at work. As we left the massive mill, grabbed our coats and bags and whatnot, we made our way through the massive exit to the mill that was one of those huge roller shutters. And waiting outside, there were all these military trucks with the tarps over them and benches in the back, lining both sides. All I can remember about being in the truck is that my co-worker and myself had no idea where we were going, but it felt like nothing out of the ordinary, and we got in the back without question. Then, after some time, we arrived at our drop-off, and we all got out of these trucks, everyone working at the lumber mill. There were loads of us, but how many I couldn't tell you. Then, the trucks left us all in the rain where we were, and we were at the walled-off enclosure. It was this huge walled-off enclosure. Felt a bit like a zoo for human beings. There were these cages all over the place, and they had sheets over them, draped over all sides and made to look like tents almost. The occupants of each tent had at least a smidge of privacy with that. It was bizarre to say the least, and they were all in rows of about 40, something like that. We were standing at the front gate to this walled-off encampment as the gate slammed shut behind us. But there we were, soaking wet in this torrential rain, looking at all these cages with families, friends and strangers inside each one, sitting on small stools and crates and such. And there were a few creature comforts like books and blankets and whatnot, but besides those, they all had the clothes on their backs and little else, as did we. I remember walking around the place while the mud underfoot came halfway up my boots, and slipping while I tried to stay upright, squelching through the puddles and tripping on discarded bits and bobs and accumulated rubbish from everybody there. There were kids cutting about, playing in the rain like it was the norm, seemingly unfazed by it all, which was a bit of a comfort if I'm honest. As I walked by one of the cages, right at the end of one of the rows, next to the colossal stone wall keeping us all inside, I remember seeing a fella sat down with some tobacco and a lighter, curled up tightly in his hand. He was hanging onto it for dear life. He was sat in the mud at the entrance to his cage, wet through, with his long blonde hair all scruffy like, over his face, looking down into the mud mostly while shivering. But he looked up at me as I went by and he said, "Excuse me, you haven't got any rolling papers, have you?" Trying to smile through the cold light. I told him I haven't and apologised and went on my way, but he sticks in my mind for some reason. This fella from the dream, it was just odd. Then, as I rounded the corner to wander up the next row, looking for a cage I could call my own, since that's what it seemed we were to do in this weird place, I was met by a woman wearing what to me looked like traditional Muslim garb of some sort. It wasn't a burqa, but I recognised it as something they'd wear. I stopped still and she smiled at me, the rain pelting off both of us as we stood there. She said, "He's coming," really excited like. Couldn't stop smiling. And somehow I knew exactly what she meant by that, and I said, "I know," and I was grinning myself. And then the rain stopped abruptly and it was total silence, unnervingly so. And she looked up over my shoulder to the clouds behind me, so naturally I followed suit, and everyone else stopped what they were doing, stood up, and gazed at these murky, miserable rain clouds. And then they started brightening up gradually, these clouds, and I could feel this intense air of anticipation. I felt nervous, but not frightened, as these clouds brightened all the more. And it got to the point that it was getting too bright to even look at without squinting. And then a cross shape appeared in the midst of all this light, like there was literally a floating cross in the clouds, and it started to descend beneath them, got bigger and bigger, till it was clearly a cross. It didn't just look like one or appear to be, it was a cross. And as it got closer, must have been something like 100 feet in the air or so, it began to morph into a person, maintaining the cross shape, but a person. And then it vanished out of view behind the massive wall. And it was clear that whatever was going on was going to go on right here where we all were. More silence, followed by a little bit more tension, apprehension, nerves, trembling. The smiles dropped, and the air felt thick as treacle. Not a single soul could move. Then there was a faint rumbling, and the puddles began to ripple in concentric circles, like that scene on Jurassic Park, you know the one I mean. And the rumbling got deeper, louder, the earth was moving. It was genuinely frightening. I remember that fear to this day. And at the far corner of this walled enclosure to my left, about 20 metres away, the wall began to crumble away. The mortar turned to dust and the huge stones began toppling down, bumping into the ground like and splashing in the puddles. And the far corner arranged itself into steps. I couldn't see around them, but they went somewhere. We were all in disbelief, watching this craziness unfold. It defied everything. Gobsmacked. And then silence again. I looked over at the fellow with the tobacco, and it was in the mud now, while his gaze was transfixed on that corner and those steps. I looked at the woman I was stood with, same thing. Not a single blink. Everyone was frozen solid, myself included. Then the silence was broken by a thumping sound, like footsteps. It was footsteps. There were more ripples in the puddles. The sound grew closer and closer, and it was coming down those steps. We all knew exactly who this was, as do you by this point. We waited with bated breath until he appeared from around the corner at the base of those steps, and then round he came, and at that precise point, every single one of us dropped to the floor, seemingly without the option not to, but nobody even thought it. We willingly knelt down, but it was also something automatic. It was strange, and I'll never forget that till the day I die. He walked up against us, 10 metres away, 5 metres away. We all had our sights fixed on the mud and the rainwater, only really able to see his feet at this point while he staggered his way through the mud. It was like he was weakened somehow, drained and fatigued. I can't tell you why, I can only relay the dream. And it seemed as if he were weary for some reason. He passed us and walked the entire length of the enclosure along this far wall until he reached the end, which from where I was roughly 50 metres away, give or take. And then he forced his hand into the adjacent wall, straight through the stone and mortar, with no effort at all, like the wall just obeyed. And he dragged out a massive sword straight from the wall. As we all watched in amazement and bewilderment and fear and everything in between, the sword slapped into the mud at the tip, splashing murky water up his leg. And then he turned, and dragging this huge sword behind him, carving a channel in the ground as he went, he vanished out of sight, and left us all in silence, feeling scared, but also protected and safe and at peace. The silence was deafening, just drips into the puddles from the cages. Then everyone picked themselves up out of the mud, slowly clambering to their feet, helping one another up and shaking off the rain. And then I woke up. To this day, I couldn't tell you what that dream was about, what it means, what I'm supposed to learn from it, or anything of any real value in terms of insight. But I can tell you I've not experienced anything like that before or since, as far as dreams go. And it made me ask questions of God. So I embarked on prayer, Bible reading, and church attendance, that I might find some answers.